This is the BigFoot 101 series. I'm Dylan Von Kleiss, North American Marketing Manager for RUPES.
And I'm Todd Helm. I am the Senior Technical Advisor for RUPES USA.
Today we're going to talk about definitions and defects, getting you all the terminology you need to understand paint correction.
And there is a lot of different uses of different words in this industry, and certainly everybody's going to apply their own definition to it. But what we want to do is, for the rest of this series, kind of operate in a framework so you guys understand what we're talking about, so our definitions make sense to you. And the first definition we're going to frame out is application. And an application is simply a series of section passes over or a complete polishing cycle. So polishing cycle and application basically means we're putting the tool on the paint, we're polishing it, and we're done. So that is an application.
Yeah, it's just a nice way of framing that all up. So an application is your section that you're doing, and from start to finish, right? You go from putting pad to paint to wiping off the compound at the end. That is your application.
And the area that you cover is conveniently named an application area.
Who would have thought?
This is very technical. Now, an application area could also be called a section, right? So those two terms are used interchangeably. And at RUPES, we consider most starting points for a section or an application area to be roughly 6 times the diameter of the pad. So that is our general recommendation. Of course, there is some variability to that.
Yeah, and it generally it makes it very easy to visualize, right? If you're working with a large pad and you take that and you place it 6 times in an area, it gives you that. If you're working with a smaller pad, 6 times. So it's a good frame of reference. To Todd's point, it's not an exact science. You don't have to stay exactly within those parameters, but it gives you a rough framework to work within so you know about the size of the section we're expecting you to work on.
And when it comes to speeds, we're going to have 2 different types of speed, arm speed and tool speed. And we do want to make a distinction. Arm speed is the rate at which you transverse across the paint. So, you know, a lot of times we get muddied down in 1 inch per second or something like this, but there really is slow, medium, and fast. And it's always relative, but this is the way we're going to define that is arm speed.
Yep, and it's a simple concept to understand, and yeah, there's not a hard, we don't want you thinking about 1/1000, 2/1000 as you're moving your arms, but if you think of general terms of slow, medium, and fast, and you'll see some demonstrations during the course of this series where you will see appropriate speed arm movement. So if that serves as kind of your ideal, then you can then justify slower or faster depending on an adjustment that you want to make.
Perfect. The next definition we're going to cover is called down pressure. Could also say pressure or tool pressure, but that is the force you're applying over the head of the tool evenly to compress the foam or wool pad to the surface. So the standard terminology is down pressure.
Yeah, exactly. How hard are you pressing that tool against the paint? And in most cases, we hope not too hard.
Not too hard. Now, one thing to consider is if you're polishing the hood, you have gravity that's also assisting in this down pressure. If you're on a side panel like a door or quarter panel, you might have to add a little bit of pressure because you lose that effect of gravity. Now, the next one is one that gets kind of muddied up a little bit, and this is the term dual action. And dual action actually is a family of movements that combine 2 separate movements inside the tool. So the 2 movements you'll typically see in a automotive polisher or paint polisher or a sander is an orbital movement, right? Which looks like this, and then a rotational movement, which is something spinning. Dual action refers to any tool that combines those movements.
Yeah, so with a dual action random orbital, you have a driven orbit and a random rotation, right? The rotation is free spinning. But in, for example, a gear driven tool like our Melee, you have a dual action tool, but the orbit and the rotation are both driven movements. Both tools make 2 movements simultaneously, but they do it in different ways.
Yeah, different functions. And one thing to consider is in a traditional body shop environment, so maybe you're coming from a body shop, the term DA or dual action usually refers to a random orbital sander. So that is that random orbit that you just spoke about, which is a driven orbit with a random free rotating backing plate. But that's where it gets a little bit muddied up, and then we have some people who are calling forced rotation polishers or gear-driven polishers dual action and defining random orbital as not. They're all under that same family, so there's a division in the family. So the next term we're going to go over is edge work. And edge work is really when we are dialing in the surface of a vehicle, the outer 2 inches of each panel, anywhere where we have to pay special attention. So convex curves, concave curves, headlights, B-pillars,
all the tiny spots, basically. Everywhere where you can't fit a full-size polishing pad easily would be considered essentially edge work, and that includes, like you said, the outer edge of all the panels where it's easiest to work with a smaller pad.
Sure. The next term, and this is important for random orbital polishers and gear-driven, is orbital diameter. And this one actually gets confusing. Orbital diameter can be referred to as stroke or throw, but basically when you squeeze the trigger of an orbital tool, that orbital movement looks like this. A good analogy would be the Earth is orbiting around the sun.
Exactly.
And that distance that it covers, the diameter from one side to the next side, is the diameter, and that is how we measure orbit on an orbital tool.
Yeah. So on a large orbit tool, right, the 21 millimeter, our orbit is 21 millimeters, or 15 is 15 millimeters. So you may not notice that movement as you're using the tool, but if you were to draw a point between kind of the far outside stroke and the far outside stroke this way, the measurement across those 2 points is your orbit diameter.
Traditionally, anything larger than 9 millimeters is referred to as a large diameter orbital, or you might hear long throw, large stroke, things like this, but they all mean the basic same thing. So going back to when we're polishing our application area, the next definition is a pass. And a pass is simply a movement of the tool in one direction. So we start from right to left, or depending on how you're looking at it, you could say south to north, north to south, up or down. But that is one time that you move the tool in one direction.
Yep.
And that, again, that's our definition to help frame the rest of the series. So a section pass is when you make a series of those movements, we'll say left to right, right to left to right, and cover that application area.
Mm-hmm. Back to one of the original terms.
Absolutely. Or a section, right? So a section pass is a complete application. Or I'm sorry, it's part of an application. A number of section passes will equal an application. Sure. And then the last thing we're going to define, or the last two things, is surface progression, but we could also call this paint correction. But surface progression is when we look at the surface and we use an abrasive technique, such as sanding or polishing, to refine the surface and actually create a smoother surface that will emanate gloss better.
Be smoother, glossier, clearer, hopefully, we hope at the end anyways, right? It's just it's very much what it sounds. It's the progression of the surface through the process of paint correction.
And then the last term we're going to define is paint defects. And paint defects are any physical or visible inconsistency in the paint surface that reduces the clarity, the gloss, or any type of visual appeal. And to get a better look at some of different paint defects, we're going to head out to the BigFoot Training Center and hand it over to Jason Rose, who's actually working on a car right now and can take the time to show us some of those in real time.
All right, thank you guys for going over those definitions. I'm Jason Rose, our Global Director of Training, and I'm going to help you understand paint defects. So we're going to talk about the wide variety of paint defects that we experience on cars nowadays. Now what you'll see on this one is a lot of these straight line scratches. So the first defect we're going to talk about is car wash marks, towel marks. These are from regular washing. Now they could be machine induced, hand induced. You go through the tunnel wash, you're washing your car in your driveway. Either way, there is always this potential that every time we touch the car in the washing process, that we might introduce some level of scratching. So if you see straight line scratches on your paint, then that is probably a car wash mark, usually from a roller, when you go through the tunnel car wash. And then there's also circular scratches. Those could be hand washing marks or towel marks. That is the most predominant defect that we see on clear coats nowadays. You're going to see those on most cars. So that's the number one type of defect. Other defects we might see are acid rain and water spots. They kind of might look the same, but water spots you obviously get from sprinklers, you get it from minerals in the rain that come down and dry on the car. So we've got some water spots on here. I don't see acid rain on here, but that's another very popular defect. We also have texture. Texture is one of those things that might be on some cars and not on others, but this is something that is generally not polishable. Most of the time you have to do multi-step sanding and polishing procedure on texture. Oxidation, so they're clear coats, just like the paints of yesterday. They do oxidize, and it appears to be fading, a dullness, a grayness, regardless of the color of the car. You'll see oxidation, and this is very polishable and very repairable. Bird droppings is another one that is very, very popular. That one can be minor, and it can be very severe. It just depends on a lot of variables, like how hot the paint surface was, how long it has been on there. There's a lot of variables on bird droppings, so some of them are repairable, some are not. So to add to our list of defects, there are some that we did not find on this particular car, but you might find on your car, and that is holograms and swirl marks. So this is a machine-induced defect, and it looks like a circular scratch. It looks like a circular pattern on the clear coat, and this is repairable most of the time, but sometimes if you get your car out of the body shop, or maybe inexperienced, untrained detailer, but somehow, or maybe even you put it in on your own, but this is a machine-induced defect. It's circular in nature, very organized scratch pattern. It's called a swirl mark or a hologram. So on this particular car, we did find some isolated, deeper scratches on the back deck lid. It appears to be the result of a purse or a package or something being dragged across the back deck lid. But that is another example of a defect that sometimes can be repaired if it's not too deep into the clear coat, and other times it can be too deep and not repairable. The other defect we can talk about is a scuff mark or other kind of paint transfer impact onto usually the fenders. Something impacts the car, or the car impacts something, and there's transfer of material onto the clear coat. This generally is repairable because it's a defect that lays on top of the clear that then can be polished off. Hopefully that helps you to identify the defects that are potentially on cars. Maybe you've seen some of these on yours. But that concludes our discussion about defects, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the BigFoot 101 series.